Welcome to the Knoy Church podcast. We're glad that you're interested in connecting through this teaching time. If you'd like to connect further, feel free to reach out to us through our website, knoychurch.org. For now, enjoy this teaching from Knoy Church, where our mission is to lead people into a growing relationship with Jesus Christ.
All right. Well, good morning. As I said before, I am really glad you guys are here. Again, here in person or online. If you're joining us online, we're really glad you're here too. I made myself a note on my notes to let you know that communion is coming up, because we're going to do communion a little differently because of everything that's going on. So in 2 weeks, on the 16th of August, we're going to do communion. When you come in to the sanctuary and you find your seat, on your seat will be a pre-packaged communion cup and a wafer, all right? So that it's only ever opened and touched by you. There'll be one person wearing gloves that puts them all out in the seat, so we're gonna do it as safely as we can that way. But for those of you who are joining us at home right now, that's your word then on the 16th to have something ready at home, whether that's a cracker or bread or it's juice or whatever it is, so that when we take communion together, whether we are separated by technology or not, we can all take communion together. Well, we are in the 5th week of our series called Ceasefire, okay? Now, I always struggle to figure out how to introduce these things, or at least recap them. Ceasefire, the reason we're talking about ceasefire is because the world that we live in is very conflicted. You don't have to look around too hard or too far to see a lot of the division, the lack of unity, the way that our culture, some of our families, some of our community groups are intent on dividing, and the division that's between them seems to grow more and more. We're in a polarized state. When we look around at our social media presence specifically, because during the quarantine, we weren't seeing as many people, most of us, right? And so the way that we were communicating was often on social media. When we look around, we notice that our presence on social media isn't always good, is it? We can get pretty caught up in some stuff. We can say some things, we can post some things, we can comment on other people's things in a way that is, well, it doesn't build them up, rather it tears them down. It lends to this separation. It lends to this polarization that's before us. And so in thinking about that and praying about that, we recognize that there is a need to call a ceasefire, for us to kind of lay down those things, the things that make us want to take shots at one another. Maybe it's name calling. Maybe we get so worked up that there are people who we would call our friends. They're on our friends list, and we call them a name. We say something that we don't mean. We take something a little too far online. We need to lay that down and call a ceasefire. Together we can come to a table. That's why there's a table up front. It's a reminder, a visual reminder for us that we're trying to come sit at the table with the people around us, to talk about peace, to talk about what it means to not be divided, okay? That's why we're talking about ceasefire. Now, I learned a new term this week. The term that I learned is fundamental attribution error. Fundamental attribution error. It kind of sounds like something that would pop up on your computer screen if you did something that you shouldn't do to the computer, right? Fundamental attribution error. It's not that, okay? Fundamental attribution error is the underemphasis of a situational explanation for a person's actions. That's very wordy, isn't it? I'll put it this way. I'm going to admit something to you. I'll be very transparent. I used to be a race car driver. I'm a little judgmental about other people's driving. All right? We all have our things, but this is definitely my thing, all right? You cut me off in traffic, there's some things that go through my head. Often not out of my mouth, but through my head for sure. Now, here's a situation that my wife and I have been in several times before. We're driving down the road, and somebody comes speeding up behind us. There's like 2 cars in front of me, all going the speed limit, and the person zooms up behind us, whips out in a no passing zone, and passes all 3 of us, and then keeps going, right? And I say something like, what a jerk that person is, right? We all think that. What a jerk. That person, that's probably how they always drive. They're probably going to zoom up the road to the next couple cars and zip around them as well. And there's going to be an accident down there, and we get kind of worked up about it. What we do is we attribute their behavior, their driving, to the fact that they must be a bad person. What a jerk. And what my wife does drives me nuts, but God love her, and so do I, because she makes me a better person. She sits in that passenger seat, and in a really quiet voice, she starts to pretend to be the person in the car that just zoomed out. She says things like, oh, my mom just got taken to the hospital. I'm trying to get there as fast as I can. Or the babysitter called, and my little kid fell, and I'm trying to get home as fast. She puts a whole different spin on why that person just zoomed right up the road. And suddenly, the person's not so much of a jerk. There's somebody who's trying to get home to take care of somebody that's hurt. And you know what's interesting? My wife was in a terrible car accident when we first started to date. And she called me, not 911. I was the first person there. And I can tell you, I went zooming up the road to go find where she had her accident. I didn't pass 3 cars, but I was not obeying the posted limit. I've literally been in the situation that my wife is kind of mimicking for me. And even though I've been in the situation, I find myself in the trap of thinking the worst about the person who's doing this thing that drives me nuts. What a jerk. What a terrible person. I think we all find ourselves in that situation more often than we'd like to admit. And maybe it's from driving. Maybe like me, you're a very judgmental driver. Or maybe it's something that happens on social media. Maybe it's something, a certain political position that somebody else takes and we don't agree with. And so in our head, we think poorly of the person. You know, in the driving example, there's one thing going on. Somebody gets hurt and they're zooming home to help that person. In the real world, there is a million factors that's going on. We're talking about ceasefire. We're talking about coming to the table of peace. We're talking about what it means to be people who are peace. There's a million factors out there. The first time in any of our lifetime, a global pandemic, okay? And again, whether you agree with everything that's happening there or not, that's besides the point, because there's a very real emotional and psychological impact of being quarantined for 17 weeks, of not seeing your friends and your family on a regular basis, of being told that in order to care for the people around you, there's certain precautions that you need to take. In order for businesses to open, you have to do X, Y, and Z. In order to patronize a business, you have to do X, Y, and Z. And there's all these people who also want to put out there that if you don't do this or you do this, then you're irresponsible, or there's a million factors right now that lead into people saying the things that they're saying, doing the things that they're doing, and the easiest thing we can do is go, you person, fill in your own word, or don't. Fundamental attribution error. Burp, burp, burp. Right on your screen, it's flashing. It's something that we find ourselves in when our actions and our hearts don't line up. This morning, the sermon is called Holy Snowballs, and we're talking about tradition. Tradition is another one of those things that sometimes put us in a place, put us in a position where our hearts and our actions don't always line up. Not all traditions are bad, and I want to make sure I say that right off the bat, especially in the Christian church. I have a lot of respect, I really appreciate, and I really enjoy some of the more liturgical denominations or expressions of church that are out there. Deeply appreciate them. But sometimes traditions end up being these empty things that we don't really understand, right? Let me tell you about a tradition that's a good tradition. When I was growing up on Christmas morning, I was blessed enough to live in a family where we had some gifts under a tree. And most kids, when you wake up, you want to go right to the gifts, right? That was not allowed in our house. First thing that we did is we went to the kitchen table. There was a birthday cake for Jesus there. And you might think that's kind of silly, but we sang happy birthday to Jesus, and we had a piece of cake. Not the most nutritious breakfast there is, but we had a piece of cake before we went to the tree. Because what that tradition did was it set the stage for us to remember today is not about the tree, today is not about the gifts, today is about the birth of Jesus. first before that, right? It's a good tradition. I understand that tradition. It's not empty. It's not like there's a random birthday cake and then I don't know why we're doing it. I understood why we were doing it. That's a good one. My wife's family, whenever they would go on vacation, they would get into the van and then they would stop. They wouldn't leave the driveway. They would pray. They would pray over their trip. They would pray for safety. They would pray that they'd have a good time as a family. They would start the vacation, the break from normal. They would start the Sabbath with prayer first. And that became such a regular thing, such a priority that even now as parents, before we were parents, just as a married couple, my wife insisted, hey, don't leave the driveway. We need to pray first. And now it's become a thing that if we get a mile or two down the road, it actually feels pretty weird that we don't do it. That's a good tradition. It's one that we understand. It's one we're on the same page about. But some traditions we don't understand. I've told this story, I think, in a devotional, or maybe I told it in a sermon before, so it might be a familiar one for you. But there's a story told by Peter Rollins, who's this theologian, and he tells a story of a monk who lives high on a mountain by himself. And he has a little hut where he lives, and he has a little chapel where he prays every day. And he gets up out of his hut, he goes over to the chapel, he kneels down and begins to pray. And a stray cat comes wandering in and begins to rub against his leg and rub against his back, and it's distracting him. The next day when he gets up, before he goes into the temple, he sees the cat. So he grabs the cat and kindly ties it to a tree outside the temple. He goes in and does his prayers. He's not distracted, comes out, lets the cat go. Well, every day, this stray cat that hung around the monastery would be hanging around the monastery before he did his prayers. So every single day, he gets up, ties the cat up, does his prayers, unties the cat, goes about his day. Well, eventually, the monk gets older. He takes on students of his own. There's other monks that join him in this place, and they watch their teacher every day before they go into prayer, tie up a cat against a tree. And so eventually, the old monk dies, and the students begin to carry on all the things that the old monk taught them, including finding a cat, tying it against a tree before they went to have morning prayers. Well, the cat died. So the student monks, they descend down from the mountain into the village and they go looking for a stray cat. They capture a stray cat, they bring him up to the top of the mountain, and before morning prayers, they tie him to a tree and they go in and have morning prayers. A terrible storm comes and the tree falls over. So they plant a new tree in the exact same place so they can tie up their cat every day before morning prayers. Eventually, these world travelers come to the mountaintop and they're watching the monks do all these things, and they begin to write down in their journals and in the books that they're going to publish about these monks that tie up a cat before morning prayers, and they begin to develop theology. Why is it good to find a cat and tie it to a tree before you do morning prayers? And they publish these things for the world to know about why this tribe does this. You see how it kind of just snowballs, right? There was a reason that the first guy tied the cat up, but that reason never got passed along to the students. The action did, without the truth behind the action. And so the students begin to repeat it without understanding why it was. In our series, we've talked about the Torah, which is the first number of books in the Bible. The Torah is the law that was handed down to Moses by God that Moses was to instruct God's people in. And the Torah is something that gets taught and explained during biblical times. They go to the synagogue, you pull a scroll out, you read it, you teach on it, you speak on it. Some of the rabbis, all the rabbis would memorize the Torah, so they would speak from memory about it. But then there was this other thing called the tradition, or the oral tradition of the law. And these were kind of expanded rules. And what they did, they called it the fence around the law. I brought a fence with me today. They called the oral tradition the fence around the law. So if you were going to break the law, one of God's commands, you'd literally have to climb over the fence to do it. That was the idea. Now, if you have your Bibles with you today, let's open up to Mark chapter 7. If you don't, we're going to have it on the screen so you can follow along there. And we referenced this in an earlier message. The first verse, I think, I read to you in an earlier message. We're going to read a little bit more of it today. So some of it might sound a little bit familiar to you. Mark chapter 7, starting at verse 1, says this. The Pharisees and some of the teachers of the law who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus and saw some of his disciples eating food with hands that were unclean, that is, unwashed. The Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash, and they observe many other traditions, such as the washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles. So the Pharisees and teachers of the law asked Jesus, why don't your disciples live according to the tradition of the elders? Catch that there? Live according to the tradition of the elders. They don't say the law, the tradition of the elders, okay. When they come from the marketplace, tradition of the elders, instead of eating their food with unclean hands, he replied, Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites. As it is written, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are but rules taught by men. You have let go of the commands of God and are holding on to the traditions of men. I'm going to pause there again. There's a distinction being made. You see the distinction? You're letting go of the commands of God and you're holding on to the traditions of men. Verse 9, and he said to them, you have a fine way of setting aside the commands of God in order to observe your own traditions. Okay, so we have Jesus here entering into the situation, and he's kind of positioning tradition as a potential problem. Okay? What's an example of that? And Jesus gives one here. Verse 10, for Moses said, honor your father and your mother, and anyone who curses his father or mother must be put to death. But you say that if a man says to his father or mother, whatever help you might otherwise have received from me is Corban, that is a gift devoted to God, then you no longer let him do anything for his father or mother. Thus, you nullify the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down. And you do many things like that. Now, that last little bit is a little weird and confusing sounding. So let me just pause there for a minute. This is an example. Jesus is trying to give an example of the problem that he is seeing here. Now, part of the command that they just quoted should sound familiar. It's one of the 10 commandments. Honor your father and your mother, okay? Now, part of honoring your father and mother then, and I would even say today too, is helping them out as they age, right? You might have an aging parent or grandparent somewhere. You help mow their grass. You maybe pay an electric bill for them. Maybe you help them out with their mortgage when you have a little extra money on the side. You kind of help out, right? Well, that's the same thing. The family setup in biblical times was that the children took care of the parents. That was part of the reason that you have children, so that there's someone to take care of you as you grow old. And so the command from God to Moses passed on the Israelites is honor your father and your mother. Part of that is for caring for them. The Pharisees at the time were allowing people to say, all of the extra money that I have is, and they say Corban. It's meant for the church. It's meant for religion. It's my tithe. I have nothing extra because everything extra I have, I give to the church. And the Pharisees approved of it. Said, sure, bring it all to the church. And what it did, it didn't allow them to take care of their parents then. They accepted this poor choice. In fact, they blessed it so they didn't have the money to take care of their aging parents anymore. They couldn't honor their father and their mother. The tradition was, if you have extra and you want to give it to the church, by all means, bring it over to the synagogue. Put it in at the temple. We love it. But that didn't leave them anything to care for their aging parents. And so Jesus says, look, you are nullifying the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down. Okay? So Jesus gives us a great example for us. See, tradition has to take a back seat to Scripture. Okay? Hear me. Tradition has to take a back seat to Scripture. Okay, now, I'm going to give you an example. In case, the whole Corban thing was still a little weird and confusing, here's one for you. Let's pretend that God's law says, thou shalt not sit in a brown chair with black legs. Okay? That is the word of the Lord, thou shalt not sit in a brown chair with black legs. So that's what gets handed to Moses, and Moses hands it to the people. And then the first generation of religious teachers, they think about it and they go, look, how are we going to help people not sit in that chair? They're tired, they're standing around, the chair is empty, they're going to want to stand, they're going to want to sit in this. How do we help them? Okay, let's say this. You are not allowed to sit in a chair that is next to a brown chair with black legs. Well, there you go. If you're going to break the law and sit in the chair, you're going to have to climb over the fence, the tradition that I just created of not being allowed to sit in a chair on either side. So what I've done is I've taken the fence from just the chair and I've moved it out to include the chairs on either side, okay? And so for the first generation, we think, well, that's pretty good. Well, you can't sit in that chair because you can't sit in the one next to it. Well, the next generation comes along and says, look, I'm pretty sure that you shouldn't be within 10 feet of a brown chair with black legs. And so what does that do? It takes the fence, moves it further out, further away. Now, what was the command of God? Thou shalt not sit in the brown chair with black legs. But now the tradition handed down by the elders says you can't sit in the chair next to it and you can't be within 10 feet of it. Okay, the next generation. How do we protect our people from going too far, of crossing that line, of jumping the fence and breaking God's law? Well, I don't think you should be in a room, the same room as a brown chair with black legs. And so now the fence is the room itself. And we can keep fast forwarding this. And look, listen, it's all well and good. It's well-intentioned. We want to protect our people from breaking God's law. So we pass down a tradition that slowly pulls the fence out until we get to the point where the religious leaders begin to debate whether you should ever shop at a place like IKEA that sells brown chairs with black legs. And so it's not about this anymore. Now it's an argument about IKEA, right? Do you understand how it gets pulled out and more and more and more becomes off limits to protect us from breaking the rule, from breaking the law? The original law had nothing to do with IKEA. That wasn't the command. The command was don't sit in a brown chair with black legs. It's a holy snowball. At the top of the mountain, you take a little snowball and you toss it over the side. And as it bounces down the mountainside, it gains speed, it gains mass. Suddenly there's skiers that are taken up by it and their arms and their legs are sticking out of it as it goes down the hill. It's a holy snowball. What did Jesus say? By your own rules, which you teach people, you are rejecting what God said. So this is a silly example. Hopefully it's one that you can remember. But let's get a little more serious. We talked about the Good Samaritan a while back. How in the world could we possibly have religious leaders who have memorized the law, who serve in the temple, and when they see a broken, bleeding, robbed man along the side of the road who's dying, can choose to cross to the other side of the road and not care for the man? It becomes a bit more understandable when it's not about the law. It's about the fence that says, don't even get close to breaking the law. The fence pushes them away from ever following God's true command. And what it takes is a Samaritan, someone who is not Jewish, someone who doesn't have the same fences put in place to realize that there is a man broken and bleeding and beat up and dying along the side of the road, to stop and to realize the fences, they're not even real. God has called me to care for the person who's lying there, right? The fences get in the way. How about the other story we talked about? We'll go back to that one where the lame man is laying beside the pool for 37 years. How in the world could a man lie beside a pool for 37 years and never make it to the pool? Because there are other people who have families that get their loved ones to the pool to be healed, and he has no one. And somehow we live in a world where it's okay to ignore the guy who stays there 37 years trying to get there. I get it. Take care of your family, right? So you take your family to the pool, and then what? You're okay going home and forgetting about the guy who's laying there for 37 years? That makes no sense. The fence is getting in the way, and we need to start paying attention to what this thing was, what this thing is, what God is calling us to. We had a campfire this past week over here at the pavilion, and we had a great conversation about church paraments out there. Maybe that's a word you do or you don't know, a church parament. Mike, I have a slide with a picture of a pulpit. Can you pull that up? Maybe you can see that. It's a little bright. Church paraments are the cloth, the drapery that goes on the pulpit, goes on the table at the front of the sanctuary in a lot of traditions. And you might think that's decoration. Well, it's not just decoration. There's meaning to that. The church paraments change color, and so green in this picture actually just means kind of an ordinary Sunday. But if they were white, it might mean Christmas or Easter. If they're blue, it might mean Advent. There's red, there's all kinds of colors, and they mean certain things according to the church calendar. Now in our church, we don't have paraments, but there was a church that I worked at before where we were starting this tradition called Youth Sunday, where the youth took over the entire church, and we did everything that adults normally do on a Sunday morning, and it meant that some youth pastor was going to do the preaching. So he had the great idea of getting rid of the pulpit and putting a music stand there because it just feels a bit more accessible. But on the front of the pulpit was this colored tapestry that he had no idea was anything more than a decoration. And as soon as he tried to move it, somebody approached him and said, "You can't touch that, you can't. That means something." "It does? I didn't know. What does it mean?" "Well, I don't know, but it's important." "Wait, you don't know what it means?" "I'm not sure, but I know that you can't move that because that's there according to the calendar or something." "Really?" And it began this whole conversation at the church that I was working at of whether or not we were gonna have these church paraments anymore. Because the people that even went there didn't know what they meant. They just knew you don't touch them, you don't move them. Not without permission, right? Tradition that is passed on without understanding, explanation, or truth is just empty tradition. Church has a lot of traditions, doesn't it? We have things like praying, tithing, volunteering, discipleship, where you try to help other people grow in their walk and their understanding of who God is. And sometimes we have done a terrible job at explaining why we do those things. Why do you tithe? When's the last time you heard a good explanation of that? What's the explanation you grew up with? Oh, if I do this, well, then God will do this, right? Or if I make sure I always give, then God will always take care of me. Like, there's all sorts of reasons why. Why do you pray? Well, if I don't pray, I think God's mad at me. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons why we do those things. And then in church, we do this other thing, where when people don't do those things, we judge them. We have a fundamental attribution error. Oh, they don't ever give because they're terrible. Oh, they never pray because they're terrible. They never volunteer because they're, oh, that person, right? Because what if they haven't been taught? What if they were never shown? What if they don't understand why that's important? What if they don't understand that things like praying and tithing and discipleship is a way to grow closer to God, is a step in your Christian maturity? What if they've never been explained those things before, and here we are going, oh, those people that don't do that thing. And what about all the things that we never meant to teach, that we teach in church on a regular basis? Oh, you know, things like gossip, things like being judgmental. Oh, yeah, those are the things that we don't want to teach. But it's the thing that every church inadvertently teaches. We taught those things really well. But we haven't ever given the chance for someone to say, look, I don't understand why in the world you would give. That's my money. Why would I ever put any money in the tithing jar in the back of the church? Why would I ever give that to the church? Or let's take on a big one that kind of crosses my mind and crosses my heart right now. Why do you go to church? It's rhetorical. I don't want you to answer. I want you to think about it. Why? For some people, it's habit. Truly. I've done this for so long, every single Sunday. I keep doing it. It's tradition. For some people, they've grown up in a world where somebody told them that if you don't go, then you're not a Christian. Or if you don't go, then God's going to be mad at you. And I'm not making a case this morning, by the way, for you not to come to church. Please, I want to make that clear. I want you to be here, but I also want you to be here for the right reasons. I want your hearts and your actions to line up. I want your lives and your hearts to be one, because we live in a world where there's a great divide. And the great divide is not over politics. It's not over theology. It is over the fact that our hearts and our lives do not line up. It's what allows us to leave a bleeding man bleeding. It's what allows us to call people sheep on Facebook. It's what allows us to argue with one another and to condemn one another. There's something missing, because our hearts say one thing and our lives are saying something completely different. I want you to come to church, but we just spent 17 weeks not coming to church. We did our darndest to make sure that we could move our church online, so that people could still participate and fellowship and be together to a certain extent in an online space. And I'll tell you, almost every church around the country did the exact same thing. And so now people are left with the question, as we begin to reopen the world and reopen society, why in the world would I go back to church? I can still be a part of church, and I can do it whenever I want. I can do it at 10 o'clock at night because the service is online. I can go to church in my pajamas. I love that one. They're good questions. I sat with a friend of mine who owns a business this week and talked with him about this very thing. And he said, in the business world, I have to make a case every day for my business to be a part of any customer's life. I've got to prove to you why you need my business so that you'll be a customer. He said, the church hasn't done that in a really long time. Oh, what an indictment against the church, that we haven't proved why you should even be a part of this in a really long time. Because we've depended on your habits and your traditions and your buy-in to things that, look, going to church doesn't make you a Christian any more than being in a garage makes me a car. It doesn't. There's something that happens in here. When you come to church, you might be a part of a small group. You might meet somebody and have a great conversation. You might hear a word of teaching or the lyrics of an incredible song that move you into a relationship with Jesus Christ. And I pray every week that happens here and that happens at home online. But being here, simply walking in the doors, that's not, check it off my list, we're all done. That's not why we gather. Why do we gather? Have we failed to pass the truth on to the next generation as to why this thing, this community, this fellowship, this time we spend on a Sunday morning is important? Are there people out there wondering now, when it's so accessible online, when it's so easy to get church wherever they want, and they can have their pick, the best speakers, the best worship, they can have it. Why should they still be a part of a church? Have we failed to teach them the truth? And instead, we've just handed them a tradition. We are busy planting trees, tying up cats, finding new cats, and finding new trees. The Apostle Paul encourages us, don't give up meeting together as some have done. Don't give up as some have done. If I'm alone, I can love God. If I'm alone, I can sing my heart out. And quite honestly, I'm a little more comfortable singing my heart out when I'm alone, and you guys should be too. But if I'm alone, I have this kind of singular relationship that exists with God. But alone, how can I love my neighbor if I don't allow myself to be around my neighbor? If I make sure that my spiritual life is always solitary, how is there a neighbor for me to love? How can I encourage my brother or my sister? How in the world can I, get this, love my enemy if I'm always alone? How can I practice bearing someone else's burdens Who will I share my faith with? Who will hold me accountable to the things that I struggle with on a regular basis if it's all about being alone? Now hear me. We are in the midst of something that is, what's the first time any of us have gone through it? And so if you're at home listening online right now, in no way should this come across as some sort of a guilt trip as to why you're not sitting in this room right now. No. What I'm saying is there's going to come a point in time when you get comfortable and you're ready to move back into in-person services. There's going to come a point in time, hopefully, I pray daily, and I hope you guys too, that this virus doesn't exist. And there's going to come a time when you can move back into online meetings. And you're going to have to ask yourself the question, why should I do that? Why is it worth that? Why is it worth the risk to be around people? Because, my friends, when we gather together in the name of Jesus, when we love one another, when we pray together, when we sing together, when we gather together, we are literally embodying God's kingdom on earth. When the disciples go to Jesus, they say, "Teacher, show us how to pray." And he gives us a prayer that we all know. And in that prayer, he says, here's something you should pray for. Pray that God's kingdom comes to earth. Your kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. When we gather together, we embody what God is calling us to. And God's kingdom is here, it is now, and it is in this place. When you love one another, when you bear one another's burdens, when you share your faith, when you have those conversations, when people begin to move from a life without Jesus into a life with Jesus, we are bearing God's kingdom here and now in this world. And that is the reason why we meet together. Because this thing that God has called us to is not just about you, it is about everyone else around you. It is about the world around you. It is about caring for the world around you. God looks out and sees all these little children that need him and need his love, and he has chosen people like you and me to work through, to be his hands and feet in this world and to share his love with them. And we gather together to do that very thing. That's why we gather together. Not because it's tradition, not because it's habit, and not because God's going to be angry at you if you don't. Because part of moving closer to God is doing so with other people. Not all traditions are bad, but good traditions don't just pass down an action. They pass down the truth behind it as well. And when Jesus was here, Jesus encountered some of the very fences that we still encounter today. And Jesus essentially said, some of these fences need to be knocked down so that we can still know what the real law is, and because there might be somebody sitting in a chair next to this one. And if you said you can't shop at IKEA, and you can't be in the same room, and you can't be in the chair next to him, how in the world are you ever going to minister to that person? If the fences stay up, the man stays bleeding. If the fences stay up, the man never makes it to the pool. The man never did make it to the pool. It took Jesus coming to the man. We are the kingdom. We are bringing Jesus into this world. And right now, we are trying to be a third way. Rather than engaging in the hatred, that's one way. Or ignoring it is another way. A third way is to cease fire. It's to step in. It's to be love. It's to embody the peace. It's to bring Jesus to the man who can't get to the pool.
Hi, this is Pastor Nick. Thanks for listening. I hope something that you heard today was very helpful. If you want to connect with us further, feel free to check us out on Facebook, Instagram, or our website, canoychurch.org. Sure, I'm glad we're in this together.